She was 31, and she had just signed away the only thing in her life that had ever made a stranger's head turn on the street. A red Ferrari 458, bought with her own money, earned in her own name, parked for 3 years in a garage she paid for every month whether she drove it or not, because driving it in the town she'd grown up and felt, to her, like showing people a wound and calling it jewelry. And with one signature on a bill of sale in a lawyer's office that smelled of burnt coffee and printer toner, Dana Whitfield traded that car, clean title, 41,000 miles, a car worth more than the house she'd grown up in, for 412 acres of black swamp mud on the far side of Larkin County that no one in 3 generations had managed to do anything with except lose money on. Settle in if you like stories that take their time getting where they're going. And if that sounds like you, subscribe and tell us in the comments what county you're watching from tonight. What none of the people laughing into their coffee at the Larkin diner the next morning knew. What none of them had bothered to drive out and look closely enough to find out, was that the swamp Dana Whitfield had just paid a fortune to own sat on top of the only water in that whole basin that wasn't going to run dry. And in 11 months, when the sky over Larkin County turned the color of a nickel and stayed that way for a season and a half, every one of the people who had laughed would be standing in her driveway, hat in hand, asking for a favor. But that comes later. First, you should know who Dana Whitfield was before any of this, because the swamp did not make her. It only gave her somewhere to finally use what she already had. Dana Whitfield was born in a 2-bedroom rental on the edge of Larkin, Texas, the only child of a diesel mechanic named Roy Whitfield and his wife Carol, who kept books for 2 feed stores and a funeral home and had, by the time Dana was old enough to remember anything, developed the particular quiet of a woman who had learned that most of what she wanted to say out loud cost more than it was worth to say. Roy Whitfield was a careful man, the kind who could listen to an engine for 4 seconds and tell you which cylinder was misfiring, and who kept his own truck running 22 years past when any sensible person would have traded it, not because he couldn't afford another one, but because he did not believe in throwing away a thing that still had work left in it. Carol Whitfield had grown up harder than Roy had, in a trailer outside Odessa with a mother who worked doubles at a diner and a father who mostly wasn't there. And she had brought into her marriage a habit of counting things twice before she believed the number money, days until payday, cans in the pantry, and she taught this habit to Dana before Dana was old enough to understand why it mattered. There was enough in that house, though never much, and Dana grew up believing that enough was a thing you built with your own hands, one overtime shift and one paid-off bill at a time. When Dana was 9, her father lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a fan belt that kicked back wrong, and though the surgeon in Midland sewed what he could and told them it could have been worse, Roy Whitfield never worked a full shift again without pain, and the family's finances went from careful to fragile in the space of one afternoon. It was after that that Dana was sent, first on weekends and then most days after school, to help out at the shop where her father still worked part-time, sweeping floors and running parts, and eventually learning to read a torque spec sheet before she'd learned long division properly. The man who owned that shop was named Earl Castellan, 61 years old, a widower with no children of his own, who had, for reasons nobody in town quite understood, taken a shine to the mechanic's gray-eyed daughter who never once complained about the smell of brake cleaner. Earl had raced stock cars in his younger years, had run a dealership in Fort Worth that went under in a downturn that wasn't his fault, and had come back to Larkin to run a small independent shop because it was the only work he knew how to be honest doing. He taught Dana things her father, in his pain and his pride, did not have the patience left to teach her: how to read a balance sheet, how to spot a customer who was about to walk without buying, how to talk a supplier down on a bulk parts order, how to look at a wrecked and worthless car up on the lift and see, before anyone else in the shop did, whether it was worth saving or whether it was only worth its scrap weight. He taught her, most of all, that the two questions worth asking about anything broken were the same two questions every time. What can be saved here, and what can't, and how much is it going to cost you to find out? And he was the first person in Dana's life who told her plainly, without softening it, that she had a head for numbers that most men twice her age in that business didn't have. From Earl Castellan, Dana received two things she kept for the rest of her life. The first was practical, a battered green ledger book in which he had, over 4 decades, written down every trick he knew for pricing a repair, valuing a trade-in, and reading a customer's face when they were about to lie to you about what was actually wrong with their car. He gave it to her the week she left for community college, and on the inside cover in his cramped mechanic's hand, he had written, "For Dana, who counts twice." The second was smaller and stranger, a die-cast model of a 1965 Shelby Cobra, the first car he'd ever owned free and clear, which he had kept on the shelf above the shop register for as long as Dana had worked there. He put it in her hands the last time she saw him, 6 months before the stroke that took him, and said only, "You'll do more with wanting one of these than I ever did with having one." Dana kept that model car on her desk for the next 12 years, through community college and a transfer to a business program in Lubbock, and her first job doing collections analytics for a regional bank, and then her second job, which was the one that changed everything. Community college had not been easy, and Dana never pretended, even years later, that it had been. She worked 26 hours a week at a tire shop off Loop 289 to cover the gap her scholarship didn't, slept 4.5 hours most nights during finals, and drove the same 11-year-old Corolla back and forth between Lubbock and Larkin every other weekend so she could sit at her father's kitchen table and help her mother reconcile the books for the feed stores. Because Carol Whitfield's eyes had started giving her trouble, and she would not admit it to anyone but her daughter. Dana's business professors remembered her, later, as the student who asked the question nobody else in the room had thought to ask. Not what the textbook said the right answer was, but what happened to the number if you assumed the person on the other end of the transaction was lying to you a little. One of them, an adjunct named Professor Acre, who taught 2 night sections a semester and ran his own small consulting practice by day, pulled her aside after a case study on distressed manufacturing assets and told her flatly that she had the instincts for the kind of work most of her classmates would spend a decade failing to develop, and that she should apply for the analyst program at the regional bank in Lubbock the day she graduated, which she did, and which hired her on the spot. The collections analytics job taught her patience with numbers that lied, and it taught her, more usefully, what it felt like to sit across a desk from people whose lives had gone sideways, and to have to decide, dispassionately, what could still be salvaged from the wreckage and what couldn't. She did that work for 2 years, did it well enough that her manager put her name forward for a rotation with a partner firm in Dallas, and it was on that 6-month rotation, reviewing a stack of failed loan collateral nobody else in the office wanted to touch, that a partner named Griffin Marsh first noticed the 24-year-old analyst who kept flagging assets the rest of the team had already written off as worthless, and kept turning out to be right about them. At 24, Dana Whitfield was hired by a private equity shop out of Dallas that specialized in something most people in Larkin County had never heard of, and would not have understood if you'd explained it to them twice: distressed asset acquisition. The company bought things nobody else wanted: failing car dealerships, half-built subdivisions, water rights nobody thought were worth the paperwork, mineral leases on land everyone assumed was played out, and they bought them cheap, from sellers desperate enough or ignorant enough not to ask the right questions, and then they held them quietly, sometimes for years, until the market or the drought or the pipeline or the population finally caught up to what the asset had been worth the whole time. Dana was good at it in a way that surprised even the partners who hired her. She had, it turned out, a genuine gift for sitting in a room full of men with better degrees and louder voices, and simply asking the 2 questions Earl Castellan had taught her over a parts counter when she was 11 years old. What can be saved here? What can't? And how much is it going to cost you to find out? She rose fast, but not easily, and the 2 years between Griffin Marsh first noticing her and her first 7-figure bonus were, by Dana's own later account, the hardest working years of her life. She was, for most of that stretch, the only woman in a room of associates who had gone to schools Dana had never heard of growing up in Larkin, and she learned quickly that the fastest way to be dismissed in that room was to explain herself before she'd been asked to. And the fastest way to be taken seriously was to simply be right, repeatedly, in front of people who kept score. She was right about a failed strip mall portfolio in Waco that everyone else wanted to write off, and the firm made $11 million reselling it 18 months later once. She'd argued for holding it through a rezoning cycle nobody else had bothered to research. She was right about a bankrupt trucking company's depot land outside Abilene, right about a played-out gravel quarry near Brownwood that turned out to sit on a vein of high-grade limestone a cement company paid handsomely to access. And each time she was right, Griffin Marsh gave her a little more rope and a little more credit, until by 28 she was running due diligence on 9-figure deals herself, briefing partners twice her age in rooms where, 3 years earlier, nobody would have handed her the coffee, let alone the microphone. By 30, she had a corner office with a view of downtown Dallas that she rarely had time to look out of, a salary that would have made her father sit down hard in a chair if he'd known the number, and a habit, developed slowly and then completely, of not spending most of what she earned, because the woman who had grown up counting cans in a pantry did not entirely trust money that arrived faster than she could count it. She called her mother every Sunday without fail, sent money home more often than her parents ever asked her to and considerably more often than they ever fully accepted, and kept, on the corner of her glass-topped Dallas desk, next to 2 monitors and a framed business school diploma, she was privately a little embarrassed by the chipped die-cast Shelby Cobra Earl Castellan had put into her hands the last time she saw him alive. The one thing she did buy at 28, 3 weeks after her first 7-figure bonus, was the Ferrari. She never fully explained it to herself, even years later, sitting in the swamp house with the propane heater ticking, why she'd bought it. Part of it was simple. She had grown up watching her father's hands, ruined and permanent, work on other people's cars so that other people could drive nice ones, and some small mean part of her wanted once to own the nicest thing in any room she walked into. Part of it was Earl Castellan's Shelby Cobra sitting on her desk, 12 years of wanting distilled down into one afternoon at a dealership on the Dallas North Tollway where she paid cash and did not blink. And part of it, the part she admitted to almost no one, was that she wanted badly for her mother to see it in the driveway of the rental house in Larkin, just once, and know that the counting had paid off. Her mother saw it exactly once. Carol Whitfield stood on the cracked concrete driveway of the house Dana had grown up in, looked at the car for a long moment and said, "Well, I hope it makes you happy, because it sure won't make you rich." She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way she said most things, like a woman closing an account she had already decided not to reopen. Dana drove the car back to Dallas that same night and did not bring it back to Larkin again for 3 years. The swamp came to her, as most inheritances of that kind do, through a death nobody grieved very hard and a will nobody expected to matter. Earl Castellan's older brother, a man named Vernon Castellan, whom Dana had met exactly twice in her life, both times at funerals, had died at 83 with no children, 1 failed marriage, and 412 acres of low, black, waterlogged land on the far southeastern edge of Larkin County that had been in the Castellan family since a land grant in 1883, and had never, in 140 years, turned a profit for anybody who owned it. Vernon had farmed it badly for 30 years, run cattle on the higher ground badly for another 20, and spent his last decade doing nothing with it at all except paying the taxes and telling anyone who asked that it was cursed, unfarmable, and not worth the gas it took to drive out and look at. There was no reason on paper for Vernon to leave any of it to Dana. But there was a codicil, added to his will 8 months before he died, in a lawyer's careful language that read, "To Dana Whitfield, in memory of my brother Earl, who spoke of her often and with more pride than he ever showed his own kin, I leave the option to purchase the Castellan Swamp acreage, all 412 acres in Larkin County parcel 417, at the price of $1, provided she takes on the back taxes, which stand at $11,400, within 90 days of my death." Dana read the letter from the estate lawyer twice, standing in her kitchen in Dallas with the Ferrari parked outside catching the evening light, the same way she had learned, at 11 years old, to read anything that mattered twice before she believed it. She drove out to see the land the following weekend. It was worse than she expected and better than the county assessor's file suggested, which was, Earl Castellan would have told her, usually the case with anything worth a second look. 412 acres of low ground along a slow tributary of the Larkin River, most of it standing water or black mud even in a dry summer, ringed by cypress and willow and choked with cattail and duckweed, with one collapsing farmhouse on a slight rise at the northern edge, and the rusted skeleton of a cattle chute half sunk in mud 50 yards from the porch. The county called it wetland classified, unsuitable for row crops, marginal for grazing, and had assessed it, for tax purposes, at less than $900 an acre. The kind of number that told you, if you knew how to read a county assessment the way Dana had been trained to read one, that nobody in the assessor's office had looked hard at that land in a very long time either. She stood on the porch of the collapsing farmhouse in a pair of ruined boots, looking out over 400 acres of mud that smelled like rot and standing water, and she did the arithmetic the way she'd been trained to do it. What can be saved here? What can't? And how much is it going to cost you to find out? 3 weeks later, she sold the Ferrari. She did not sell it out of sentiment, and she did not sell it in anger, and this is a point worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the part of the story that the Larkin diner crowd got wrong for the better part of a year afterward, and it is worth getting right. Dana Whitfield sold the Ferrari because she had spent 6 years learning to read distressed assets for a living, and somewhere on that porch, standing in mud that came up over her boots, looking at cypress trees that had been standing in that same low ground since before the land grant that first carved the parcel out of the county, she had understood something that none of the men in her Dallas office would have understood if she tried to explain it to them, and that none of the people in Larkin ever gave her the chance to explain either. The swamp wasn't worthless because it was wet. It was undervalued because everyone who had ever owned it had tried to make it into something it wasn't: a cattle pasture, a row crop field, a hunting lease, instead of asking what it actually was and what it might be worth for exactly that. What it was the lowest ground in a 40-mile basin, sitting directly above a slurry-charging pocket of the Larkin Aquifer that every hydrology report Dana pulled from the state's public records office, going back to a 1961 Army Corps survey nobody had looked at in 60 years, described as unusually deep and unusually stable compared to the shallow wells the rest of the county depended on. The swamp stayed wet, generation after generation, drought after drought, not because it was cursed, the way Vernon Castellan had always said, but because water was moving up into it from underneath, slow and steady, the way water does when it's found the lowest point of a basin that sits on top of a deep and generous source. Nobody had ever drilled a proper well on that land, because nobody who had ever owned it had needed one. The swamp was already wet. Why would you drill a well into a swamp? Dana Whitfield sat in her Dallas office 2 days after that first walk through the mud, pulled every hydrology and well log record the state of Texas had on file for that basin, cross-referenced it against 30 years of drought cycle data from the Regional Water Authority, and came to a conclusion that she wrote down in the back of Earl Castellan's green ledger book, in her own hand, beneath 40 years of his. This land is not a swamp. This land is a reservoir wearing a swamp's clothes. And in 11 years of drought cycles going back to state records, the aquifer beneath it has never once dropped below what a modern well could reach. She sold the Ferrari the following Monday to a dealer in Fort Worth for $211,000, cash, and paid the $11,400 of back taxes on the swamp the same week, and put the rest, nearly $200,000, into a savings account she did not touch for the next 4 months while she finished out her notice at the private equity firm and made arrangements to move to a house that, when she first saw it, did not have working plumbing. Word travels in a town the size of Larkin the way water travels through low ground, quietly, along the path of least resistance, until suddenly everybody's boots are wet and nobody remembers exactly how it happened. By the time Dana's moving truck pulled into the driveway of the old Castellan farmhouse, most of Larkin County already knew 3 things, and knew them in this order of importance. That the Whitfield girl had sold that fancy sports car, that she'd sold it to buy the Castellan swamp, and that she had, by every measure anyone in town knew how to apply, lost her mind. At the Larkin diner, where Carol Whitfield's old coworker Pam Delgado still worked the counter 6 mornings a week, the story got told and retold with the particular relish small towns reserve for a smart person doing something that looks, from the outside, spectacularly dumb. Dale Ferris, who ran the feed store and had known Roy Whitfield 30 years, said, loud enough for the whole counter to hear, that Vernon Castellan must be laughing in his grave, getting a fool to pay 11 grand in back taxes for a piece of ground he himself couldn't give away. Somebody's cousin who worked in the county clerk's office confirmed the assessed value, and for about 6 weeks that spring, worth less than $900 an acre, became a kind of punchline that followed Dana around town whether she was there to hear it or not. Her mother heard it too, of course, because in Larkin there was no version of a thing happening that Carol Whitfield didn't hear about by supper time, and when Dana drove into town to see her that first week, Carol stood in the same cracked driveway where she had once looked at a Ferrari and told her daughter it wouldn't make her rich, and looked at her now with an expression Dana had not seen on her mother's face before, not anger exactly, and not quite grief, but something adjacent to both. "You had it, Dana," her mother said. "You had the thing everybody spends their whole life trying to get to, and you traded it for a piece of ground your Uncle Vernon couldn't grow weeds on." "He wasn't my uncle," Dana said. "He was Earl's brother. You know what I mean." "I do," Dana said, "and I know what I'm doing." Her mother looked at her a long moment, the same look she used to give a stack of receipts that didn't quite balance, searching for the number that was hiding somewhere in the columns. "You always did think you were smarter than everybody else in this town," she said, not unkindly, the way she said most things. "I don't think that," Dana said. "I think I just count twice." Her mother didn't have an answer for that, and Dana drove the 2 miles back out to the swamp house alone, past 3 separate people she'd gone to high school with, all 3 of whom slowed their trucks to get a longer look at the woman who'd traded a Ferrari for mud. She did not go back into town to explain herself to anyone. She had learned, from 6 years in rooms full of men who underestimated her math before they'd finished being introduced to her, that explaining yourself to people who have already decided what they think of you is a losing trade every time. What she did instead, the following morning, was put on the same battered boots, walk the 412 acres end to end with a notebook and a hand level, and begin. For the first 3 weeks, Dana Whitfield did nothing that looked, from the road, like anything at all. She walked the property in the mornings before the heat came up, marking rises and low points on a hand-drawn map, checking the old cattle chute and the collapsed fence lines, wading into the standing water in waders she'd bought second-hand from a hunting supply store in Midland, to check the depth in a dozen different spots with a length of PVC pipe marked off in feet. She spent the evenings on the porch of the farmhouse, which still had no working electricity, going through the green ledger book by lantern light, running numbers that had nothing to do with feed prices or repair estimates, and everything to do with well drilling costs, water rights law, and the price per acre-foot the Regional Water Authority was quietly paying that year for any landowner willing to lease pumping rights during drought contingency periods. A program almost nobody in Larkin County had bothered to read the fine print on, because almost nobody in Larkin County believed, in a year when the spring rains had come on schedule and the Larkin River was running full, that they would ever need it. The work Dana did first was the work Earl Castellan would have approved of. Water first, then access, then shelter, then everything else. She hired a drilling contractor out of San Angelo named Kurt Ibarra, a heavyset man of 50 with hands like split leather, who laughed out loud when Dana first told him where she wanted the test well sunk, not on the high ground by the farmhouse, where every sensible person drilled a well, but down in the lowest, wettest part of the swamp itself, where the standing water never fully receded even in August. "You're gonna hit water in about 4 feet digging a well there," Kurt told her. "Questions whether you hit anything worth pumping underneath the water you're already standing in. That's the question I'm paying you to answer," Dana said. Kurt Ibarra's rig punched down through 11 feet of black organic muck, then into a layer of dense clay that ran another 30 feet, and then, at 43 feet, into a gravel-and-sand formation that the driller's log described, in Kurt's own handwriting, as unusually productive, strong artesian pressure, water rising to within 6 feet of surface unassisted. He drilled a second test well at the opposite end of the property, on the higher ground near the old cattle chute, expecting a different result and finding, instead, the same formation, the same pressure, running the entire low length of the 412 acres. "In 30 years drilling wells in this county," Kurt Ibarra told her, standing by his rig with mud to his knees, "I have put down maybe 4 wells that came back like this. And every one of them was on land somebody's granddaddy called worthless." Dana wrote that down in the green ledger too. She spent the next 4 months doing the unglamorous work that never makes it into the version of a story people like to tell each other at a diner counter. She filed the well logs with the county and the state water authority, which took 11 weeks and 3 separate trips to Austin. She had the property properly surveyed for the first time in 40 years, correcting 2 boundary errors that had sat unnoticed in the county records since 1979. She paid a local contractor, a quiet man named Hollis Rays who'd done roofing and foundation work around Larkin County for 20 years, to shore up the farmhouse foundation and replace the collapsed section of roof over the kitchen. And she paid him in full on the day the work was finished, the way Earl Castellan had always paid his suppliers, because a woman who wanted to be trusted with money needed to be seen paying people promptly and in full. Not all of that work was hers alone by the end. She cleared the old fence lines herself, with a borrowed brush cutter and blistered hands, because Roy Whitfield's daughter had grown up believing that some kinds of work you did yourself even when you could afford not to, so that you'd know exactly what the land under your feet actually was. That was slower, harder work than anything Dana had done at a desk in 6 years, and she came to understand, doing it, why Earl Castellan had always said a person's judgment about a piece of ground or a piece of machinery was only as good as the hours they'd actually spent touching it. She learned which sections of the old barbed wire could be salvaged and restrung, and which had rusted through and needed replacing entirely, learned to read the low spots in the pasture by where the grass grew differently after a rain, learned, from an afternoon spent knee-deep in a drainage cut arguing with a stuck fence post, exactly how far down the black topsoil ran before it gave way to the dense gray clay Kurt Ibarra's drill would later punch through at the well sites. Each of these small, physical facts went into the same notebook as the well depths and the survey corrections, because Dana had learned in her Dallas years that the asset nobody else understood was always the asset whose details nobody else had bothered to collect. and she meant to know this ground better than any castellan who'd ever owned it and complained about it in the same breath. She was not entirely alone in that work, though she started out that way. Holly's raise, once he'd finished the roof and the foundation, kept coming back on weekends even after Dana had paid him in full for the contracted work, first to help with the fence line, then to help clear brush from what would become the second well site. And Dana came to understand, watching him do it, that Holly's raise was a man who had learned somewhere along the way that a job done right and a friendship built alongside it were not two different things, and that he had decided, without ever quite saying so, that the swamp woman everybody else in town was still laughing about was worth the extra weekend hours. Mrs. Ainsley from the feed store sent her nephew out twice that first summer to help haul lumber, refusing payment both times, saying only that she remembered Roy Whitfield fixing her own husband's truck for free. The crop failed bad enough that nobody in the family had 2 nickels to rub together, and that some debts in a town like Larkin didn't expire just because the people involved had changed. She had the electric co-op run a line out to the farmhouse, at a cost that made her wince and pay anyway, because a woman intending to live somewhere needed lights that worked and a refrigerator that ran. She got the old cast-iron stove in the kitchen working again with parts ordered from 3 different suppliers, and an afternoon of trial and error that would have made Earl Castellan proud in a way her Dallas salary never had. There was a week, early that first August, when the propane budget ran thinner than Dana had planned for, and she ate rice and canned beans for 6 straight days rather than dip into the money she'd set aside for the second well. And she wrote that week down in the ledger too, the exact grocery total beside the exact well-fund balance, because Earl Castellan had taught her that a woman who wanted to trust her own numbers later needed to have written down the hard weeks honestly at the time, not softened in hindsight. She patched the porch steps herself with lumber left over from Holly's raise's roofing job, learned to ken the wild plums that grew along the old fence line because Mrs. Ainsley at the Larkin feed store, no relation to Dale Ferris, and one of the few people in town who never once made the Ferrari joke to Dana's face, sold her second-hand mason jars for $0.10 apiece, and taught her the water bath method over one long Saturday afternoon. She drove into Midland once a month for supplies she couldn't get in Larkin, kept every receipt in a cigar box that later graduated to a manila folder, and then to an actual filing cabinet Holly's helped her haul in on the back of his truck. And she never, in that entire first year, spent $1 on anything that didn't either keep the roof over her head or move the well project forward by a measurable amount. By the end of that first summer, the farmhouse had stopped being a ruin and started being, slowly, a house. And underneath 412 acres of mud that the county still valued, on paper, at less than $900 an acre, sat a fully permitted, fully documented artesian well system that Dana Whitfield now understood, with the particular cold clarity of a woman who had spent 6 years pricing distressed assets for a living, was worth more than the Ferrari, more than the $200,000 she'd banked from selling it, and possibly more than every other piece of land in Larkin County combined, if the thing she suspected about that basin's long-term water cycle turned out to be true. She did not tell anyone in town what she'd found, not because she meant to humiliate anyone later, though it would come to look that way to some of them, but because a woman who had learned to count twice had also learned that the value of information is a fragile thing, easily destroyed by saying it out loud in the wrong room too soon. The drought that hit Larkin County the following spring did not announce itself the way droughts do in stories. It came the way most real disasters come, which is slowly, deniably, one missed rain at a time, until the missing had added up to something nobody could deny any longer. March came dry. That was not unusual for Larkin, and nobody remarked on it beyond the ordinary grumbling of ranchers watching their stock tanks. April came dry too, and by the 3rd week, the county extension office sent out its first bulletin of the year noting that regional rainfall totals were running 40% below the 10-year average, a number that made the local paper's back page, but nobody's kitchen table conversation yet. May, which in Larkin County usually brought the hard spring rains that filled the stock tanks and topped off the shallow wells for the summer ahead, came dry as a bone, and by the end of it, the sky over Larkin had settled into the low, bleached, merciless white that everyone who had lived through the 11 drought remembered in their bodies before their minds caught up to what it meant. By June, the shallow wells started to fail. They failed the way shallow wells always fail in a drought, not all at once, but in a slow cascading order that followed the geology of who had drilled deep and who hadn't, who had drilled recently with modern equipment, and who was still running on a well their grandfather had put down in 1958. The Delacroix place went first, out on the flats where the water table had always run thin. Then 2 of the Ferris family stock wells failed, then the Hendrick Dairies irrigation well. By a July that broke the county's all-time heat record on 4 separate days, nearly a third of the private wells in Larkin County were pumping air, sand, or nothing at all. The municipal system serving the town itself was running its reservoir down at a rate the water authority's own bulletins described, with the flat understatement of people trying not to start a panic, as a matter of ongoing concern. Among the wells that failed that July was the one belonging to a woman named Sherry Combs, a widow of 62 who ran 40 head of cattle alone on 110 acres her late husband had left her, 3 miles east of the Castellan land, and who had never once, in 11 years of widowhood, asked anybody in Larkin County for a favor she couldn't pay for outright. Sherry's well had been drilled by her father-in-law in 1971, and had never given her a moment's trouble until the 2nd week of July, when it started pulling sand, and by the 3rd week, it was pulling nothing at all, and Sherry Combs spent 4 days hauling water in a stock trailer from the county's emergency distribution point, 45 minutes each way, because she could not afford the $11 a load trucking fee on top of everything else that summer had already cost her. She told almost no one how bad it had gotten, because Sherry Combs was the kind of woman who counted her own troubles, the way Dana had once watched her mother count cans in a pantry, quietly and without an audience. And it was Pam Delgado at the diner counter who finally mentioned to Dana, in passing, that Sherry hadn't been in for her usual Thursday coffee in 3 weeks. Dana Whitfield's wells, 43 feet down in ground the county still assessed at less than $900 an acre, ran exactly as strong in July of that drought as they had the November before, because the aquifer beneath 412 acres of black swamp mud did not answer to the same rain the shallow wells depended on. It answered to a slow, deep recharge cycle that Kurt Ibarra's driller's log had hinted at, and that Dana's research into the 1961 Army Corps survey had confirmed. And that survey, along with 30 years of drought cycle data, was still sitting, quietly, in the back of a green ledger book on a kitchen table in a farmhouse most of Larkin County had stopped driving past, having run out of new things to say about the fool who'd traded her Ferrari for a swamp. The swamp itself, meanwhile, did the thing swamps do in a drought that surprises people who have never watched one closely. It did not vanish. It receded. Standing water that had covered better than half the low acreage for as long as anyone in Larkin could remember drew back, over the course of that dry summer, to a fraction of its usual footprint. It exposed black, rich, deeply organic soil that had been sitting under 6 inches to 3 feet of water for longer than the county's oldest living resident could recall. And in a low channel near the eastern boundary that nobody had ever been able to walk in wet years, it exposed the partial remains of what turned out to be an old stone ford, hand-laid limestone, clearly 150 years old or more, part of the original wagon crossing the 1883 land grant survey had referenced, and that every Castellan who'd owned that ground since had assumed was a myth, because nobody had ever seen the water low enough to find it. Dana found it on a Tuesday morning in late July, walking the drying mudflats in the same ruined boots she'd worn her first day on the property, and she stood over those hand-laid stones for a long time before she understood what she was looking at. Standing over those hand-laid stones, she understood two things at once, the way you sometimes do when a piece of research you filed away 18 months ago suddenly connects to something in front of you. First, that the Ford confirmed, in the plainest physical terms available, exactly what her research had told her about the basin's hydrology, that this ground had been the low, wet crossing point of that whole watershed for a century and a half at minimum, which meant it had been recharging from the same deep, stable source for at least that long, which meant the well system beneath her feet was not a lucky strike, but a genuine, durable, long-term asset. The second thing was harder to sit with, standing there. The county's tax assessment, the one that had made her the punchline of the Larkin diner counter for the better part of a year, valued this land on paper at less than $900 an acre, while the town of Larkin itself, 12 miles away, was 3 weeks from declaring a water emergency. Dana drove out to Sherry Combs's place herself, the same week Pam Delgado mentioned the missed coffee, without calling ahead, because a woman who'd once had her own father go quiet about the pain in his ruined hand, rather than ask for help, understood exactly the kind of pride she'd be up against. She found Sherry in the barn, hauling a half-empty water trough by hand, and Dana didn't make a speech about it. She said she had more water than she knew what to do with, said the lease rate would be whatever the county's own drought contingency program was paying that season so nobody could call it charity, and said she'd have Kurt Ibarra's crew run a line out within the week if Sherry was willing. Sherry Combs stood in that barn for a long moment, cattle shifting behind her, and said, "Your Uncle Vernon used to tell my husband that swamp of his wasn't worth the taxes on it." "He wasn't my uncle," Dana said. "But he was wrong about the land." "Guess he was," Sherry said, and that was the whole negotiation. The line went in 9 days later, and Sherry Combs's 40 head never missed a drink for the rest of that drought, and she was, though neither of them ever made a thing of it, the first person in Larkin County Dana Whitfield helped, 3 full weeks before anyone else came up the drive with their hat in their hands. The first person to come up the drive asking, rather than being sought out, was not who Dana expected. It was Dale Ferris, the feed store owner who'd made the loudest joke about Vernon Castellan laughing in his grave, standing at her door on an August morning with his hat literally in his hands, in the old, unembarrassed way men of a certain age in Larkin County still did things when they needed something badly enough to set pride aside. His own stock wells had failed 6 weeks earlier. He had cattle he could not water on the trucked-in supply the county was rationing at $11 a load. And he had heard, everyone had heard by then, because word travels through a drought-stricken county even faster than it travels through gossip about a traded Ferrari, that the Whitfield girls' wells out on the old Castellan place hadn't dropped an inch all summer. "I know what I said," Dale told her, standing on the porch Holly's rays had rebuilt the summer before. "I know what everybody said. I'm asking anyway." Dana looked at him a long moment, the way her mother used to look at a column of figures that hadn't balanced yet, and she thought, standing there, of Earl Castellan's 2 questions, what can be saved here, and what can't, and she understood that the question in front of her now wasn't really about water at all. "I'll lease you what you need for your herd," she said. "Same rate the water authority's paying out on drought contingency leases, which is less than you're paying the truckers right now. And Dale, I'm not doing this to make a point." "I know it," Dale said, and for the first time in 14 months, he did not sound like a man delivering a punchline. Others followed in the weeks after, not everyone, and not all at once, because pride in a town like Larkin dies slower than a shallow well does, but enough of them that by September, Dana Whitfield had signed 11 separate water leases with ranchers and small farmers across the county, priced fairly, documented properly in a set of contracts she wrote herself, in language plain enough that nobody signing them needed a lawyer to explain what they were agreeing to. She hired Holly's rays back, this time to help lay pipe out to 2 of the nearest properties. She hired Kurt Ibarra's crew to drill 2 additional wells to handle the new volume, this time without a single laugh from anyone on the crew about where she wanted them sunk. Each lease got the same treatment in the green ledger that every well cost and every grocery receipt had gotten the year before, written down in full, in ink, the acreage, the rate, the date signed, the date the pipe went in. Dana kept a second, smaller notebook that summer too, one she never showed anybody, in which she wrote down not numbers but names. Dale Ferris, 11 days after he stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, brought over a truckload of feed for no reason he ever explained, and left it by the barn without knocking. The Hendrick family, whose dairy operation had been 3 weeks from having to sell off half their herd, sent their teenage son up twice a week all that fall to help Holly's raise with the pipe laying, unasked and unpaid, until Dana finally insisted on paying him the same as she paid any other hand. A woman named Louise Tran, who ran the only pharmacy in Larkin and had never said 2 words to Dana beyond ringing up a purchase, quietly cut the price on every prescription Carol Whitfield filled that autumn. And when Dana found out and tried to thank her, Louise only said that a town that didn't look out for its own water didn't deserve to call itself a town, and that she'd heard what Dana had done for Sherry Combs before anybody asked her to. It was not, Dana understood by October, that Larkin County had simply reversed its opinion of her, the way a courtroom reverses a verdict. It was slower and less clean than that, and more honest for being slower. People who had laughed did not stop being the kind of people who'd laughed. They simply had, now, a second fact sitting next to the first one, and small towns are, whatever else can be said about them, generally willing to hold 2 facts about a person at once and let time sort out which one matters more. There were exceptions, and Dana never pretended otherwise. Vernon Castellan's one surviving cousin, a man named Dwight Castellan who lived 2 counties over and had contested the Wills codicil, unsuccessfully, the year Dana first took possession of the land, wrote her a letter that autumn suggesting that the well income by rights belonged to the family and not to some banker's girl Earl took a shine to. Dana answered the letter once briefly, citing the probate court's ruling, and never responded to the 2 that followed. Some slights, Earl Castellan had told her once over a parts counter, are not worth the ink it takes to answer them a second time, and Dana had counted that piece of advice as carefully as any number he'd ever taught her to read. The county council meeting where the emergency finally became official business ran 4 hours, on a Tuesday night in late August, in a high school gymnasium because the regular council chamber couldn't hold the crowd that showed up once word got around that the town's own reservoir had 11 weeks of supply left at current usage. Dana sat in the 3rd row, in a plain blue button-down she'd bought at the feed store's small clothing rack rather than anything left over from her Dallas years, and listened to the county judge lay out numbers that were, by then, no surprise to her at all, because she had been running the same numbers herself for 2 years. She did not raise her hand to speak that night. She let the county come to her, the following week, the same way Dale Ferris had come to her porch, because Earl Castellan had taught her that the deal you negotiate from a chair somebody pulled out for you is always a better deal than the one you chase standing up. Perry Odom, the county's water authority director, a careful, tired man who had spent that whole summer fielding calls from ranchers with nothing left to say to him, drove out to the Castellan place himself not long after, sat at the same kitchen table where the green ledger lived, and laid out what the county needed. Emergency pumping rights, a 15-year commitment, infrastructure the county would help fund, but that would sit on Dana's land under Dana's control. Sitting there, he admitted that his own office had assessed this land under $900 an acre for as long as he'd worked there, that nobody on his staff had pulled the 1961 Army Corps survey in the whole time he'd been director, and that he did not enjoy driving out to a woman half his age to admit the county's own records had missed, for 6 decades, the single most important piece of infrastructure in the basin. "I'm not here to make you feel bad about it," Dana told him. "I'm here to make sure this county has water for the next 15 years. Let's get the terms right and worry about who missed what some other day." He looked at her for a moment the way Kurt Ibarra had looked at his own driller's log the day the second test well came back, and said only, "All right then," in a voice that reminded Dana oddly of her own father's. Dana listened the whole way through without interrupting, the way she'd learned to do in 6 years of due diligence meetings with men who assumed her silence meant she hadn't understood the terms yet. And when Perry Odom finished laying out the county's side, she pulled out a folder, not the cigar box anymore, not even the manila one, but a proper set of typed proposals she'd drafted over the 2 previous weeks, anticipating almost exactly the conversation she was now having, and slid it across the table, reading through it slowly, the way a man reads something he did not expect to be handed already finished. He looked up and said, "You knew we were coming." "I read the reservoir bulletins the same as everybody else," Dana said. "I just read them a few weeks earlier than the council did." They signed the deal 3 weeks later, in the county judge's office rather than a gymnasium, on terms that were fair to the town and profitable to Dana, and that guaranteed, for the next 15 years, that no drought in Larkin County would ever again mean what it had almost meant that August. The local paper ran the story on its front page, above the fold, with a photograph of Dana standing at the wellhead that Holly's Rays had taken on his phone, and the headline writer, who had covered the Ferrari sale 18 months earlier with considerably less generosity, chose 4 words that got repeated around the county for the rest of that year. "Swamp Girl Saves Larkin." Dana kept a copy of that front page, folded once, in the back of the green ledger, not out of vanity, she told herself, but because Earl Castellan had taught her to keep a record of every deal that mattered, and this was the deal that mattered most. Her mother came out to the farmhouse the week the county deal was signed, stood on the porch, and looked out over the drying swamp toward the wellhead where Kurt Ibarra's crew was still finishing the last of the new lines, and said nothing for a long while. "You knew," Carol Whitfield finally said. "Not a question." "I counted twice," Dana said. Her mother nodded slowly, the way she used to nod when a ledger finally balanced after an afternoon of finding the error, and she reached out and put her hand, briefly, on her daughter's shoulder, which was as close as Carol Whitfield had ever come in 31 years to telling Dana she was proud of her. Roy Whitfield did not come out to the swamp property until the week after the county deal was signed, and he came alone, on a Saturday morning, in the same truck he'd been driving for 2 decades, and he stood in the yard for a while before he knocked, the way Dana remembered him standing in front of an engine he was about to diagnose, taking the measure of a thing before he touched it. He had never said much about the Ferrari, one way or the other, in the 3 years Dana owned it, and he had said even less about the swamp when she bought it, beyond a single question, asked once over the phone the week she signed the paperwork on the back taxes. "You sure, Dana girl?" She had told him she was, and he had said only, "All right then," in the same flat, careful voice he used to tell a customer their transmission was done for, a voice that did not waste words on feelings it hadn't yet confirmed. Walking the property with her that Saturday, his ruined hand tucked into his jacket pocket the way it always was in cooler weather, when the old injury ached worst, he looked at the well heads and the new pipe runs and the rebuilt farmhouse roof with the same slow, appraising attention he'd once given a fan belt about to fail, and when they finally sat down on the porch steps, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "Your granddad Whitfield lost the family place in '58, he said. "Cotton land, out past Sweetwater. Bank took it in a bad year, and there wasn't a thing anybody could do about it, because nobody in this family ever had 2 nickels of cushion between what we owed and what we had. I grew up hearing about that place like it was a person that died. And I swore to myself, working on other men's cars my whole life, that I was never going to be the reason my own kid grew up the same way, scared of the ground going out from under her." He looked out over the drying swamp, toward the well head, and then back at his hands, the whole one and the ruined one both resting on his knees. "I watched you buy that car," he said, "and I didn't say anything because it was your money and you earned every dollar of it clean, and a man doesn't get to tell his grown daughter what to do with what's hers. But I'll tell you now what I couldn't find the words for then. That car scared me a little. Not because it was foolish, because it was the kind of thing that could disappear on you in one bad year, same as your granddad's cotton land, and you'd have nothing left to show for 6 years of work but a repossession notice and a story." Dana didn't say anything. She had never heard her father talk this long about anything that wasn't an engine. "This," Roy said, gesturing out at the 412 acres, "this isn't going anywhere. Water under the ground doesn't repossess. And Sherry Combs's cattle drinking off your well, and the Hendrick boy learning pipe fitting from Holly's raise on your dime, and the whole county not going dry because you read a survey nobody else bothered to open. That's not a story that disappears in a bad year either. That's the kind of thing that just keeps being true." Standing up slow, the way a man stands up who has said more in 5 minutes than he usually says in a month, he put his good hand briefly on Dana's shoulder, the same unshowy gesture Carol had made at the well head weeks before, and said, "Your mother and I are proud of you. We should have said it plainer and sooner. I'm saying it now." Roy drove back into town before lunch, and Dana sat on the porch steps a long while after his truck had gone, and she wrote that conversation into the back of the green ledger too, word for word as close as she could remember it. Not because Earl Castellan had ever taught her to keep a record of things like that, but because she understood, sitting there, that some entries in a ledger are not about money at all, and are worth keeping anyway. The Larkin diner counter told a different story that fall than it had the spring before, and it told it, as these things go, without a single person at the counter ever quite admitting they'd been the one telling the old version. Dale Ferris told it best, in the version that got repeated most, sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee he could finally afford again, because his herd had made it through the drought without a single head lost to thirst. He told it the way Dana herself never bothered to, with the Ferrari front and center, the swamp made to sound as worthless as everybody had believed it was, and the reveal when it came, delivered like a man laying down a winning hand. "Girl sold a $200,000 car for 400 acres of mud," Dale would say, and every one of us laughed ourselves sick about it. Turns out she wasn't buying mud. She was buying the only water in this whole county that wasn't going anywhere. Pam Delgado, still working the counter, would usually add the detail Dale left out, because Pam had heard it straight from Carol Whitfield, who had finally started telling it herself, with something that had stopped being embarrassment and started being the particular pride of a mother who had once stood in a driveway and told her daughter a fast car wouldn't make her rich, not knowing that her daughter was already 3 years into proving a much stranger and much better point. She didn't get lucky, Pam would say, refilling somebody's coffee. She read the water reports nobody else bothered to read. She drilled where nobody else would have drilled. And she never once told anybody in this town what she'd found, right up until the day this whole county needed it. On a still afternoon in late October, when the drought had finally broken with 3 days of steady rain that filled the swamp back toward its old boundaries and turned the exposed stone ford back under 6 inches of water, Dana Whitfield sat alone at the kitchen table of the farmhouse Holly's Rays had rebuilt, in the light of the electric lamp that had replaced the lantern 2 summers before, with the green ledger book open in front of her at the page where, 3 years earlier, she had written 11 words in her own hand beneath 40 years of Earl Castellan's. "This land is not a swamp. This land is a reservoir wearing a swamp's clothes." Beneath that line, in the years since she had added her own running account, the price of the well permits, the cost of Kurt Ibera's drilling, the 11 water leases and their terms, the county contract and its 15-year guarantee, the exact figure the county assessor's office had finally, that same month, revised the land's valuation to, a number that would have made Dale Ferris choke on his coffee if she'd ever told him, which she never did. She had, laid out on the table beside the ledger, 3 other things. She had the die-cast model of the Shelby Cobra that Earl Castellan had put into her hands the last time she saw him, its paint chipped now from 12 years of moving between apartments and offices, and finally, to a farmhouse kitchen table, sitting where a man who never got to see what became of the girl he'd taught to count twice would have wanted it to sit. She had the driller's log from that first test well, Kurt Ibarra's handwriting describing water rising unassisted to within 6 feet of the surface, the page that had turned a joke into a fortune. And she had a photograph, taken by Holly's Rays on his phone the day the county deal was signed, of Dana standing at the wellhead with her mother beside her, neither of them smiling exactly, both of them looking at the camera the way people look at a thing they've built with their own hands. A long moment passed before she moved any of it. The model car had come from a man who had watched her sweep a shop floor at 11 years old and known, before her own father's pride let him say it, that she was clever. The driller's log had come from a stranger who'd laughed at where she wanted to sink a well, and then eaten every bit of that laugh 2 years later. The photograph had come from a mother who'd once told her a fast car wouldn't make her rich, and who had never once said she was sorry for saying it, and had never needed to, because standing in that photograph beside her daughter at the wellhead was as close as Carol Whitfield's whole life had trained her to get to it. She thought of Dale Ferris's hat in his hands on the porch. She thought of a driveway 2 miles into town where 3 trucks had once slowed down to get a longer look at a fool. She did not think of any of it with heat. She thought of it the way one thinks of weather that has already passed over a well that has since been drilled. They had laughed at her cheaply, and it had cost them nothing but the shape of their own faces for a season, and most of them had never once driven out to look closely at what she'd actually bought, because looking closely would have asked something of them they weren't yet ready to give. The plain admission that a woman with a spreadsheet and a pair of ruined boots had read that ground better than 3 generations of Castellans who'd farmed it and cursed it, and never once asked what it actually was. Dana Whitfield closed the ledger, banked the fire in the rebuilt stove, and went out onto the porch, where the last of October's rain was still dripping off the new roofline into ground that, 412 acres wide, would never again in her lifetime be called worthless by anyone who'd bothered to look. She had been 31, and she had traded the nicest thing she'd ever owned for 400 acres of mud that a whole county laughed at her for wanting. It was the best trade she ever made. If you have stayed with Dana this far, out past the Ferrari and the punchlines at the diner counter, down into the mud where a driller's rig found water nobody else thought to look for, take a moment now before you go. Tap the small heart beneath this story so the channel knows you were here. And if it moved you, share it with somebody who has been laughed at, quietly or loudly, for trading something everyone understood for something nobody did. Subscribe if you haven't yet, so the next story about a woman who counted twice when everyone else only counted once finds its way to you. Tell us in the comments what county or country you're watching from tonight, and whether it's raining there, or dry, or the kind of bleached white sky that means a season everybody's going to remember for the wrong reasons. And before you go on with your evening, sit with this a moment. Almost every one of us has been handed, or has chosen at some point, a thing that other people were quick to call foolish. A trade nobody else would have made. A piece of ground, or a relationship, or a line of work that everybody around us looked at once, decided they already understood, and never looked at again. The people who laugh at trades like that almost always laugh because they haven't done the arithmetic, and because doing the arithmetic would ask something of them. They don't want to give the work of counting twice, of walking the ground itself instead of trusting what everybody already agreed it was worth. Dana's story is not, in the end, about a well beneath a swamp. It is about the habit of looking patiently, and without shame, at what other people have already decided is worthless, and trusting that the man who taught you to count twice over a parts counter, or the driller who laughed at where you told him to dig, or the mother who once told you a fast car wouldn't make you rich, or the father who never found the words until the ground under his own daughter had finally proven itself, all of them in their own way. We're teaching you exactly what you'd need to know the day the sky finally turned. It is worth remembering, too, that none of what Dana built came from a single lucky discovery. It came from 3 years of unglamorous, uncelebrated repetition, walking the same acreage until she knew every rise and fall of it by feel, writing every dollar into the same green ledger, until the habit of honesty with her own numbers was as automatic as breathing, paying every contractor in full and on time, until a whole county of people who'd laughed at her once had, without quite admitting it to themselves, started to trust her word before they trusted anyone else's. The drought did not make Dana Whitfield's fortune. The drought only arrived, the way droughts always do, to test what had already been quietly built underneath the mud for 3 patient years, and it found the ground solid, because she had made it that way, one honest entry at a time, long before anyone else in Larkin County thought there was anything down there worth finding. So the question we leave you with tonight is this: what have you traded or been handed that other people were quick to call foolish? And what might you find if you walked it end to end yourself in your own boots before you believed what everyone else already decided it was worth? Tell us in the comments. We read them in the evenings by our own lights. Count twice, keep your ledger honest, and we'll see you again down the next muddy road.